of Masechet Zevachim, making fantastic progress. I'm surrounded by a bakery, a shawarma restaurant, and a coffee shop over here in fantastic Ramat Beit Shemesh Dalet. Just nipped in one of the best broadcasts you will taste over here, friends. And we are continuing and progressing this entire tractate in today's page. We're talking about sacrifices in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. That's the topic that we are grappling with today. Now, we have already learned the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Simon, this was, who ruled that upon entering the land of Israel and erecting the tabernacle, which we very much learned about, temporarily in Gilgal, which is this place, the people could not bring obligatory sacrifices until the tabernacle was established in an area in a more, let's say, permanent manner, where obviously we learned very about this, I believe, in page 114. Only 3 days ago. Now, the position, let's say this specific position itself, would be up for dispute over here. Because why was this, friends? By other rabbis, as we're going to actually learn and grapple with in today's page of the Gemara, friends. Now, it's interesting. The great rabbis, the wise rabbis, the chachamim, they're going to rule that all sacrifices, all korbanot that were brought in the midbar, in the desert, were brought on the altar in Gilgal as well, the area of Gilgal. And in both places, individual sacrifices were limited to a korban olah. What is korban olah? We've learned about it many times. A burnt offering, or a korban shelamim. This is a peace offering. Now, Rabbi Yehuda rules that all korbanot, all sacrifices that were brought in the desert, were brought on the altar in Gilgal, including all public sacrifices, as well as private sacrifices. The difference between the two periods was that upon arriving, let's say, in Israel, even when the Mishkan was operating in the area of Gilgal, people were allowed to build bamot, private altars. However, they were limited only to a korban olah, or a korban shlamim. Now enter Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir believes that any private sacrifice that was a neder or nedeva, this is naturally voluntary sacrifices, they could be brought, these two things, on a private altar. For example, the sacrifices brought by someone who voluntarily accepted Nazirut upon himself. Now, we learned all about this in Tractate Nazir, which we learned about, I think, nearly 3 years ago it happened. I very much recommend everyone to look back and do Chazar on those, on what we spoke about over there within regards to Masechet Nazir. Now, there is one case where everyone's going to be united and agree that a public obligatory sacrifice was brought on the altar in Gilgal. Very interesting. So, according to the story in Sefer Yoshua in chapter 5, very interesting, we're talking about the book of Joshua over here, because we're actually in an area where Joshua fought some of his wars. We learn about in Sefer Yoshua, we're in an area of Ramat Beit Shemesh Dalet, we're recording this. And quite nearby, there's a famous Tel Yarmut, where Joshua famously killed the king of Yarmut in one of the wars that actually took place in that point in time. But going back from the side points, according to the story in the book of Joshua, in chapter 5, the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, crossed the Jordan River, the Yarden, just prior to Pesach, and they brought the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, in Gilgal, almost immediately upon their arrival. The uniqueness of the Korban Pesach lies in the fact that although it is obligatory on every individual, it is viewed as a communal sacrifice, since everyone is required to bring it at the same time, and it is eaten in groups rather than by individuals. So very, very interesting. We're learning about the sciences within regards to Korbanot. And just something I wanted to say about yesterday's page of the Gemara, because many people requested an insight with regards to yesterday, because I did something very short. So actually took something from the awesome, that was actually from Rav Adin Seinsal's previous, let's just say, presentation of here. But there's a question within regards to oaths in yesterday's page of the Gemara, which we learned about in Daf Kuf Tet Zayin, naturally. The question posed by Rav Mendel Weinbach was the oath for both people? When the Torah was given to the Jewish people, the sounds and thunder, as we learned about in Parshat Yitro in chapter 19 of Sefer Shemot, accompanying it were heard throughout the world when the Torah was being given. Rabbi Eliezer Hamodi says that the kings of all nations were seized with fear in their palaces and sang praises to God. This is the scene described by King David HaMelech, when he speaks of powerful sound encompassing the universe, which would result in each in his, let's say, palace giving honor to God, as we learn about in the book of Tehillim in chapter 29. Now these panic-stricken rulers, they all came, let's say, to Bilam and asked this wicked person to explain the meaning of these sounds, which they feared would herald a world-destroying deluge. He reassured them that God had already taken an oath never again to destroy the world through a flood, as we learn about in Parshat Noach, obviously in the book of Bereshit towards the start of it. When they raised the possibility that if this oath did not preclude destroying the world through fire, he again reassured them that the divine oath precluded destruction of the entire world through any medium, and that the alarming sounds they heard were merely those accompanying the giving of the Torah by, let's say, God to his people. Now, just to progress within regards to this point, the impression we get from this dialogue is that God's oath made after the, let's say, the world-destroying waters of the great deluge, and as we learn about in Parashat Noah, receded was not limited to water, but would include fire as well. It's something that we very much have learned about over there. So very, very interesting. How do we get that? This seems to be in conflict with the Gemara. Actually, we learn about in Masechet Sota, I think in page 11. That is a very, very classic daf in of itself, the Masechet Sota 11, with tons of information on different happenings, which I recommend everyone to learn. That Gemara in Sota in Daf 11, Yud Aleph, describes the deliberations of Pharaoh and the Egyptians in how to persecute the Jews in their land with that heavenly retribution. So actually in these parashot at the moment, we happen to be in Sefer Shemot at the moment, so very much in collaboration, you could say, with Daf Yomi. They rejected the idea of oppressing them with fire or sword because of the awareness that divine justice could punish them for this midah keneged midah, this measure for measure. They therefore decided to suppress the growth of the Hebrew nation through water. Now, confident that God's oath to refrain from another deluge would preclude punishing them through water, this reasoning would actually lead them to decree the drowning of newborn Hebrew children, very, very atrocious and anti-Semitic. And they were nevertheless punished measure for measure by eventually being drowned in the Yam Suf, as we learn about in Parashat B'Shalach, the Kriyat Yam Suf. They would actually, thank God, be drowned, and Am Yisrael were able to walk miraculously and cut through the sea. Now, it seems from this Talmud, this Gemara, that the Egyptians assumed that the divine oath did not preclude fire, while Bilam told the kings that it did. The great commentator, the Maharsha, he offers a resolution of it. Now we know Bilam, as we learn about in Parshat Balak, in the heart of the book of Bamidbar. Bilam's point was that the divine oath precluded universal destruction through any medium. The error of the Egyptians, let's say here, was to extend its oath to the fate of an individual nation. They assumed that God had ruled out destroying even a single nation through water, while reserving their option to do so through fire. As obviously we see in the above mentioned Gemara, which points out their fatal error was in misinterpreting the divine oath, which dealt only with universal destruction, but left them as a single nation, vulnerable to this midah keneged midah, measure for measure punishment through water, which very much we learned about over here. So it's an action-packed week of Gemara, where especially between Dafim 114 till we culminate in 120, we're going to have a grand siyum towards the start of next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, towards start of next week, which is going to happen to be Parshat Va'era. We've learned various different topics in this week, like with regards to animals disqualified for sacrifice in Bet HaMikdash, which are offered outside of it. That's what we learned in page 114. We've learned about the Asham, sacrifice of the Nazir and the Metzorah, the sacrificial service before the establishment of the Mishkan sanctuary. The sacred silence of Aaron, if you look back on page 115, we talked about that, the silence over there. The animals which found refuge from the great deluge and which are offered as sacrifices. That's what we learned about. It's actually interesting. I was telling my kids last night when I was putting them to sleep a story on the book of Noah, and on that topic. Obviously, today we've learned about the reverberations of the Torah given at Sinai, the sacrifices of non-Jews we can learn about in this week's page, the camps in the wilderness and their counterparts in Jerusalem, We learn about which sacrifices were offered on the altar outside the Mishkan. We learn about what was heard by Yitro and Rachab, very much that's towards the start of the book of Joshua also. The wanderings of the Mishkan, we can learn about these stories. There's actually a phenomenal story about Bet Shemesh within regards to the Arona Brit that would actually travel. I think that's more in the book of Shmuel, which I recommend. And we're going to culminate the Talmud, the differences between the Mishkan and the major and the minor Bama. Now, a very, very interesting, cute thing I wanted to point out within regards to page 115. We missed out on about a week ago. There was a phrase that said, we were talking about golden silence and golden speech, once again taken from Rav Mendel Weinbach. And likewise, regarding Shlomo, the verse states, I think this is book in Kings, if I'm not mistaken, a time to be silent and a time to speak. At times a person is silent and receives reward for silence, and at times a person speaks and receives rewards for speaking. Very famous to think. Now, in that page over there, we learned in that specific topic, it was explained the example of being silent and receiving reward. This was an example of Aaron. We learned about in, I think, Parshat Shmini, if I'm not mistaken. He had the silence when he accepted that it was God's will that his sons, Nadav and Abihu, would pass away. And let's say on the other hand of that spectrum over there, we learned about that Rashi, based on Kohelet, I think in chapter 3, verse number 4, he stated a time to speak and a time to be silent, cites 3 examples of rewarded speech. He looks at the other way. For example, Az Yashir, we've learned about once again in Parshat Beshalach in chapter 15. That was sung at the splitting of the sea. There was also the song of the prophetess Deborah, in the book of Shoftim in chapter number 5. After Israel's victory over the Canaanites, she spoke but did a lavish song. And the call of the prophet Hosea, which you learn about very much in chapter 14 in that book, in verse number 3. For the Jewish people to do teshuvah, to repent, and to take words with you. Words of supplication and prayer, important, once again, using speech over there. Another time when it's certainly a time to speak is when learning Torah, obviously. You know, when one time a great rabbi came inside a Beit Midrash, a study hall, and it was all quiet and said, it's like a dead place, this is. And they said, why? We're all learning. No, but they can't hear you. There needs to be thunderous rapture of Torah words being stated when you're inside a Beit Midrash. Although the Mishnah in Avot teaches, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would say, all my life I've been raised among the sages, the rabbis, and I have found nothing better for the body than silence. Your Torah commentaries explain over there that silence that is praised here refers to minimal speech about physical matters. Regarding learning Torah and mitzvah fulfillment, however, it is praiseworthy to not be silent, but to use the power of speech to its highest degree. Something very interesting to point out over here. And we're coming to the grand siyum of over here of Masechet Zevachim only in the coming days at the moment, which is very, very much exciting at the moment. I think I'm going to check out this bakery now, and we are going to buy something and order something and just get a coffee. I'm going to go live to do a video on history of the Netherlands community over here. And we're going to speak about it and grapple within regards to that over here. As every single day, we do a tidbit on the Daf Yomi daily page of Gemara, and we get some inspiration and so on and so forth. And we learn about various different topics and sugyot within regards to that. We're coming to the end of Zevachim, so watch this space for more Talmud that's going to come in the next tractate, which every single day we'll have a tidbit. And what a bakery over here. Just to nourish the day, to say mezonot, and to eat and to power our Eidah day for more Torah learning. Bezrat Hashem Yitzchak. So wishing you all a fantastic day, friends. Take care and be well, and watch your space for more fantastic content of it. So be well and thanks.